Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this discussion on postmodernism and the important people who are associated with the development of the concept of postmodernism. The very first that we are going to talk about is Jean Baudrillard, 1929 to 2007. Jean Baudrillard was a French socialist, sociologist, philosopher, and cultural theorist. He is best known for his analysis of media, contemporary culture, and technological communication, as well as his formulation of concepts such as simulation and hyperreality. Let's briefly understand what he wants to say through these words. Baudrillard's notion of simulacra is linked to the idea of hyperreality. Baudrillard's interest lies in the structures like Disney World, television, and photography, where he suggests we are so caught up in the image and its copies that we have no access to any reality beyond the image itself. The representation, that is, the image, bears no relation to any reality whatever. It is its own pure simulacrum, according to Baudrillard. What we see in Disney is a glossy, glamorized visual representation of something whose original we will never know. The use of Raja Ravivarma's paintings and calendars, of Picasso and other artists in mass or popular cultural forms popularizes these great works of art. However, our only access to these great works is through the copy or imitation, where we will never see the original. In other words, for us, the copy becomes the original itself. Copies and further reproductions of the great works are made from these copies. What we thus have are copies of copies. The great works of these copies, like the Che Guevara t-shirts or Nike's swoosh on locally manufactured products, each of which is cloned or copied from an earlier copy. Postmodernity is characterized by the endless circulation of the copies. Yes or no? Signs are not exchanged for objects or even meaning, never again exchanging for what is real, but exchanging in itself in an uninterrupted circuit without reference or circumference, as Baudrillard argues in 2003. Thus, the image, the copy, and the photograph constitute our knowledge of reality because we cannot know anything other than the image. This is simulation, where the process of image making and the copies and the reflection are more important than the real because there is no real at all. Interesting, isn't it? When he talks about the real and copy, Baudrillard writes, there is an escalation of the true, of the lived experience, a resurrection of the figurative, where the object and the substance have disappeared completely. We cannot distinguish between the real and the copy anymore in the postmodern world. Thus, the reality of war for us is just the image, the visual that appears on our television screen or our computer screen. The image making of the war itself is so realistic with the super technology, the embedded journalists, that it takes on the appearance of a cinema. When the WTC tower fell, one of the comments recorded was, "It is like an Independence Day." The comment suggests that the only way in which we can comprehend and apprehend and approach the horrific event is by comparing it to a cinematic scenarios of disaster. The very language of horror in cinematic and our access to the reality of WTC is via a movie image. The only way we can make sense of Mumbai 26/11 attacks is through the televised images that seem to echo, double, parallel commando action films. Our knowledge of commando action on 26/11 is based on a simulation of it that we have seen in films. Yes or no? And so, Baudrillard talks about a new concept called simulation. Simulation is the norm of postmodernity, according to Baudrillard. We live in an age saturated with images, maps, models, and signs that have become ends in themselves and for which we have never known the originals. Thus, we only have signs without an external reality or copies without originals. We cannot distinguish between the real and the artifice any longer because there is no real we can recognize. We only know the image of the real. What Baudrillard is painstakingly developing here is the theory of representation. He suggests that nothing exists outside representation. The hyperreal is this world of simulations and excessive science and is the only real world we will ever know. We do not consume objects but the sign of the objects. This is what he terms as implosion, 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 the collapse of meaning in the age of empty sign or signs without reference for us to connect to. Every sign merely is leading us to other signs. Baudrillard's attributes this simulation culture to the excessive influence of the media, especially television and screen cultures. We see the world only through this media. Our appraisal and interpretation of reality is influenced by films, media representations, images of such reality. And so he also links it to urban capitalism, where capitalist strategies involve concealing the inequalities of society behind images of production, prosperity, and efficiency. Consumer capitalism takes this a step further, where we can only know the finished product, but we'll never know where the product comes from, the process of production or distribution. Thus, we consume a mango drink even though it is more than likely that we in urban India may never see a mango plantation or even a mango tree. Surprising, isn't it? Our knowledge in inverted commas, our knowledge of the mango is only through the sign or representations of the mango on the bottle. This is our only reality because in consumer capitalism, with differentiated production, outsourcing, and scattered markets, products are not local and we do not attach a history, culture, or specific practice, or say growing mangoes, the smell in the marketplace, and so on and so forth to that particular product. This is the simulated world in which we belong. And as written by Baudrillard, in the present day where we are completely connected to the screen, either it is the mobile screen or it is the computer screen, Baudrillard's simulation can be understood even more better. The next person in the postmodernism is Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze was a French philosopher who from the early 1950s until his death in 1995 wrote on philosophy, literature, film and fine art. His most popular works were the 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, both co-written with the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari. In fact, Gilles Deleuze talks about reality and virtual reality. Deleuze in Difference and Repetition, published in 1994, extends Baudrillard's notion of simulacra but also contests it. Baudrillard, as we have seen, proposes that there is no possibility of distinguishing between the real and the virtual, the original and the copy. Deleuze argues that this is a false dichotomy because very simply the original is itself a copy. There is nothing like original. The original itself is a copy and the actual or real building is based on the idea of a building, an image in the builder's eye or mind. For us to recognize the building, we need to have a prior image of the building. Thus, Deleuze sees the actual as actual virtual, where everything real has the potential to become virtual, to produce its own images. Deleuze is here responding to Plato's argument that there exists a true model, that is the idea or the ideal of which we see copies. Further, Plato distinguishes between good and bad copies. The good copy is that Plato calls it as eikon, and the bad copy is called as phantasma or simulacrum. Eikon, which is a good copy or a good copy, is one that possesses an inner resemblance to the original model, whereas in phantasm or simulacrum, there is only a superficial resemblance to the ideal. Deleuze argues that Plato finds simulacra frightening because they have no fixed identity. Their identity is so slippery, ephemeral, and also illusory. They resemble the original, but that resemblance is itself illusory and minimal. In other words, simulacra refers to a condition where the delusion or illusion is all there is, lack of depth or inner essence that calls the original. Deleuze's shift was in treating Deleuze's shift was in treating the actual or real as possessing the ability to become the virtual. He argued that we cannot discern the virtual potential in any building or anything real until it has become an image. That is, the potential of the real to become virtual is not visible to us when we see the building actually. We can realize this only when we see the image or the photograph or the cinematic image. This process of actual virtual of the inherent potential for all real to become virtual is what Deleuze calls simulation. Simulacrum is the power of anything actually to become something else, to become an image, to be the other than the actual. In other words, simulacrum is the power of the actual to become virtual, and simulation is the virtual becoming the actual. Very interestingly, simulacrum and simulation of Baudrillard as well as Gilles Deleuze is along with Félix Guattari, the next post-structuralist. Félix Guattari, 1930 to 1992, was a French psychoanalyst, political philosopher, semiotician, social activist, and a screenwriter. Together with Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari has written a number of texts related to simulacra and simulation. He talks about schizophrenia. There is so much of overlapping between the simulation and simulacrum that you tend to think about many things within your mind, that all these virtual things actually start existing in the mind first and then in reality next. So much so that you enter into a world of all images considering that they are real and you start behaving accordingly. So schizophrenia is a serious mental illness in which a person confuses the real world and the other world of the imagination and often behaves in strange and unexpected ways. So you have the positive, you have the negative, as you could see in the picture. You have all sorts of simulation and simulacrum in the mind first, considering all the imagined things to be real and talking and behaving accordingly. And later you become so that you start accepting the virtual reality to be the actual reality. Thereupon you will be called as schizophrenic because you tend to talk erratic, you tend to behave in a very abnormal way, considering the fantasies, the imagination and your own imagined things to be real. So in this virtual reality of simulacrum and simulation, man becomes schizophrenic and the thoughts become rhizophrenic, according to Gilles Deleuze and Guattari, which becomes an important aspect of postmodernism. The next wonderful person associated with postmodernism is Jean-Francois Lyotard, 1924 to 1998. He was a French philosopher, sociologist, and literary theorist. His interdisciplinary discourse spans such topics as epistemology and communication, the human body, modern art and postmodern art, literature and critical theory, music, film, time and memory, space, the city and the landscape, the sublime, and the relation between the aesthetics and the politic. Very interesting topics. Yes or no? Lyotard talks about all these things in the postmodern world. The postmodernity of Lyotard can be understood when we slightly look into what he's trying to say. One of the most influential theories that arose in the later half of the 20th century was developed by Jean-Francois Lyotard, often described as postmodernism. Lyotard's work has influenced numerous thinkers across social sciences, philosophy, and literary criticism. He begins with a very simple idea. In the age of computers and multinational corporations, new modes of knowledge emerge, over which the state or any dominant ideology may have little or no control at all. Knowledge becomes a commodity whose acquisition leads to power. The status of knowledge changes because the nature of acquiring it, storing it, and disseminating it changes. This is called as postmodernity. Lyotard argues that the identity and the sense of self of a culture is based on the knowledge generated and codified about this culture, either by itself or by others. We exist within language and representations as names, as affiliations, and as descriptive categories. As Lyotard puts it, in a move that anticipates the work of post-structuralists, I quote, "The human child is already positioned as the referent of a story recounted by those around him in relation to which he will inevitably chart his course. This positioning is the location of the child, his identity, and the self within a body of knowledge." Lyotard then proposes that this body of knowledge is in fact an organization of narratives, and this is what is called as the postmodernity. He also talks about knowledge and narratives in a very beautiful way. Everybody is located within the narrative because narrative is the quintessential form of customary knowledge. It is therefore important to see what kinds of narratives any culture produces about itself. A country's history, for example, that showcases the achievements of its great men and women, or the narrative of progress in any culture, constitute such an organization of the nation through narratives. In India, for instance, a history book that maps India's progress from various dynasties to a republic would be the production of the body of knowledge in a particular kind of narrative. The cliche, unity in diversity, I quote, is a narrative where we suggest that India is a pluralistic, multicultural society. These narratives and cliches are not neutral bodies of knowledge. They are politically significant because they create and disseminate ways of thinking and maintaining the identities. Lyotard talks about the postmodern condition in which a modern man is. He argues in his classic work, titled as The Postmodern Condition, this is the title of his essay, that no philosophy or political theory or narrative can be totalizing. Thus, Marxism's idea of class conflict and emancipation, Hegel's spirit of history, Freud's repressive psychosis are all totalizing perspectives and give very little space for alternative views of the world. These could be speculative narratives about the march of history, for example, or they could be emancipatory narratives such as the one about the right of man to pursue happiness, the narrative that inspires American War of Independence, for example. In postmodernity, Lyotard argues we can perceive a resistance to grand narratives, what he famously calls as incredulity towards meta-narratives. Grand narratives are meta-narratives. Lyotard opposes these meta-narratives or grand narratives. There is no credibility left for any such grand narratives because they have revealed themselves to be oppressive and homogenizing, and because we have seen them to be representations rather than absolute truths. Instead of these grand and totalizing narratives, we have small voices coming up, which he calls as petite narratives. Petite narratives is small, local, heterogeneous narratives. Postmodern thinking opts for the fragmental, the anecdotal, the liminal, and the marginalized. It celebrates the contingent and the fluid over the fixed stability of totalizing theories. Lyotard inaugurated the key theoretical note in postmodernism when he characterized it as a resistance to the grand narratives and focused on the marginal, the liminal, and the fragmented, arguing against totalizing systems of thought. History writing is one of the most important forms of narrative in any culture. Lyotard argues that in any age when grand narratives have collapsed, we cannot anymore study a universal history, because that would mean ignoring the peripheries in favor of a unified account. Events such as the Holocaust upset the grand narratives of modernity, argues Lyotard, and thus suggest that universal histories are simply untenable. Events unassemblable to grand narratives are what tells us about the necessarily incomplete nature of all narratives. By rejecting the totalizing narratives, postmodernism resists any homogenized explanations and theorizing. Notions of truth, history, culture, politics, all these will carry no sense when looked at it from meta-narrative point of view, because all the micro-narratives and the petite voices have got a different notion to talk about culture and history and nation. Yes or no? So postmodernism resists any homogenized explanations. The notions of truth within any such narrative, argues postmodernism, are exercises in power and seek to homogenize differences in order to create a sense of harmonious truth. In actuality, such truths conceal many differences, prevent resistance, and gloss over the minor and the marginal. And hence, postmodernism opposes the meta narratives. It is in this way that it becomes one with post-structuralism. When we talk about postmodernism, it definitely overlaps with post-structuralism in its emphasis on language and the idea that meaning is unfinalizable. Like post-structuralism, it calls for a greater attention of strategies of representation rather than the final meaning of such representations. As we have seen in the case of Baudrillard, postmodernism focuses on the modes of meaning production without seeking the truth or the real behind the production. It argues that we can only know the images and the representation and not the actual reality beneath, if at all it is there. So, like post-structuralism, postmodernism also believes in the discursive and linguistic construction of reality and truth. Nothing exists outside the language. Here, Lyotard proposes that scientific knowledge cannot exist outside of a narrative, even though science has always presented itself as beyond narrative. Thus, knowledge itself demands a narrative form. Lyotard expands the notion of narrative to include history, science, social theory, in addition to the literary narratives. Scientific statements, he argues, are presented in particular kinds of narrative, and every narrative shows or follows the conventions of that discipline. Thus, the narrative of science appropriates the language or the discourse of empiricism, proof methodology, and so on. In literary and cultural theory, postmodernism's greatest contribution has been to collapse the distinction between high culture and low culture. Postmodernism treats the shopping malls, the advertisement poster, the bumper sticker, the graffiti, and Shakespeare as equal and important, even if they belong to two different genres. Genre mixing and collapsing categories are favorite postmodern devices. Postmodern authors like Marquez, Salman Rushdie, Barthelme, Barth often embody postmodern views in that the sense of play, for example, non-linear and circumlocutus narrative styles, the mix of genres, the rich mix of street culture with high culture, like Shakespeare, are features of the works. In each case, the author shows how we cannot take any one form rather of thought or of one genre as distinctive because every genre partakes with that of other. And hence, postmodernism is therefore characterized by a refusal to accept any system of thought or theory of universal. No thought or no system is universal. A preference for fragmentation over unity, dispersion over linear order, the anecdote over the epic, the blurring of boundaries between high and low culture, a sense of playfulness, contingency, and self-reflexivity, an interest in the surface, the image and the copy rather than the in-depth, the reality and the original, a fascination with the strategies of representation rather than the truth of or behind the representation, an emphasis on the discourse, the language and the narrative rather than on the reality those supposedly convey, a desire for flows, shifts, multiplicities rather than order, organization and tyrannical coherence. These, dispersive ways of thinking, exactly postmodernism and post-structuralism become one with each other. Thank you for being a part of this very beautiful talk on postmodernism and postmodern thinkers. Bye for now.